Well, it's all a bit of a mess. I'd gone and dug a hole for myself, and I wasn't sure how to dig myself out. What's crucial to understanding this whole situation is my own position in the local community. I'm Pearly, born and bred. I've lived in this neck of the woods all my life. About 15 years ago, me and the missus and our Kevin moved to Blackleaf, a village about 3 miles south of Purley. I don't have much of an education. I left school when I was 16, but as everyone will tell you, I've done very well for myself. I own the 3rd largest chain of tanning boutiques in East Surrey. My son Kevin runs the business now, so I'm officially retired, and I spend most of my time tinkering with classic cars. I've always been handy with a spanner. I used to work for Loxham's, the Austin Morris dealership in Croydon, where the big carpet warehouse is now. I used my redundancy to set up the first tanning boutique with my missus out front dealing with the customers. She's always had a very nice tan herself. It's not just my own cars I work on. I make a few bob repairing old cars for local car nuts. It's only for pocket money. Not that I need the income. I'm a millionaire 3 times over, and me and the missus live in a 7-bedroom detached house in the mock Tudor style with a little bit of Spanish colonial thrown in for good measure. I'm on the Goodstone Road Committee. I chair the local crime watch meetings, and I've been a member of the local Conservative Party ever since the days of St Margaret. We call our house the Thatchers on account of her, although it's only the garage plot which is actually thatched. And in the garage I have a collection of classic cars. All British, of course. Mostly Triumphs and MGs, and the missus has a brand new Range Rover Evoque, but that stands outside. Pride of place is my 1973 Triumph Stag in Java Green, which is a bit in your face, but it's quite a rare colour. The main point of all of this is that I'm very well known locally. I've got my fingers in all sorts of pies, and I've got a reputation to uphold. That's what this is all about. Reputation. Which brings us to the matter in hand. Now, it all goes back about 7 years when Ewan and his wife moved into the old farmhouse on Wattenden Lane. He's a retired professor. Very well spoken in a sort of posh Scottish way. Very old school, if you see what I mean. I mean, you could say he was an eccentric. I mean, you go into their house, it's like stepping back in time, and he dresses like a refugee from the 1950s, all tweed jackets and elbow patches. Put it this way, in Ewan's case, it's not just 1 foot in the past. Although, funnily enough, his style might be antiquated, but some of his attitudes are very modern. Too modern for my taste. His wife, what's her name? Oh, she's Malaysian or something. Apparently, she's a graphic designer. I never know what to say to her. I've never had much to do with Orientals. We don't get many foreigners around here. It's all very English, which suits me well enough. Ewan says she's the only Malay in the village. She doesn't have much to say for herself. I asked Ewan if she's shy, and he said you should see her when you're not around. You see, I think she's as uncomfortable with me as I am with her. I suppose Ewan and his wife are used to a more cosmopolitan environment. Don't think they really fit in around here. Now, Ewan was always out on his drive, tinkering with some classic car or other. Like me, he has quite a collection, but in his case, it's all foreign stuff. 2 Citroens, a rare Lancia, a pre-war Alfa Romeo and a Renault 4 for every day, which isn't worth much, but it's his favourite because he's had it since he was a student. Oh, and a Fiat. That's the most modern one, but it's still over 50 years old. Often as not, anyone walking up Wattenden Lane who's halfway interested in old cars sees Ewan out there tinkering and stops and has a chat with him. That way, he gets to know Malcolm, who lives around the corner and has an immaculate old Rover, although he doesn't use it much. Spends most of his time polishing it. But Ewan was more interested in driving his cars. Turns out he's never owned a modern car. Surprised his wife puts up with it. He used one of them every day. That's the one thing we had in common. About the only thing. Malcolm's from Glasgow, so he gets on well with Ewan, who's from Edinburgh originally, although I think he'd lived in London all his working life. Now, I look after Malcolm's old Rover, and hearing that Ewan's on the lookout for a mechanic, Malcolm puts him on to me. You see, Ewan had all these cars, and although he did the routine maintenance himself, he needed help with anything a bit more complicated. He told me he'd tried a couple of the local garages, but found them next to useless. So, I help him out with a few jobs on his Fiat. It was getting hot and bothered in heavy traffic, and it turns out the fan had been put on back to front, so it was blowing rather than sucking, if you see what I mean. Surprised one of those garages didn't spot that. Seems like useless was just about the right word. And the car was badly out of tune as well. Don't know who'd been working on it before me. Still, anyway, it was a cash in hand and a nice little learner for me. Now, the trouble with having so many cars is that there's always something needs doing. So, a few weeks after I sorted out his Fiat, I get a text from him. His Renault had broken down on the bypass. Well, I had enough on my plate, so I just ignored it. I suppose I could have replied and said I didn't have the time, but frankly I couldn't be bothered. It's not that I didn't like Ewan at the time. Oh, he seemed all right. Always very courteous in an old-fashioned sort of way. I always felt like I had to mind my P's and Q's when he was around. We had a few chinwags over a mug of tea. He might not have been very practically minded, but he certainly knew his stuff about cars. The history of different models, who designed them and what have you. Oh, and he had a very dry sense of humour. Sometimes you had to work really hard to realise that he was actually joking, but I never felt like cracking any of my jokes in front of him. Well, mine usually involved, certain minorities, or were a bit racy. Well, more than a bit. The fact is, I never felt completely at ease in his company. He just wasn't my type of bloke. He's a bit of an intellectual. And, to make matters worse, a Ramoner. Although that didn't come up until the referendum, and I'd known him about 3 years by then. I'd known from the outset that he was a Labour Party member, which was a surprise in a way. As I said, I've always been a Tory, although I did think of voting UKIP back in 2015. Either way, our political differences didn't seem to matter until the issue of Brexit came along. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself because a few months after I ignored his last text, I had a bit of time on my hands, and Malcolm mentioned that Ewan was having a bit of trouble with his Alfa Romeo. Now, I've never worked on an Alfa before, so I fancied the challenge. But as it turns out, whatever I tried, I couldn't get it running smoothly. It was a devil to start. So, a few months passed by with the occasional text or message from Ewan. I was busy with other things at the time, so I don't pick up the phone or reply to his texts or his voicemails, but that's just my way. I just didn't fancy replying. I'd only have to tell him that I was busy, so what's the point? I've done the same with others and it didn't do any harm. Look, to be honest, I'd rather work on British cars, especially Stags. Well, the owners are more my cup of tea. It's funny how certain types of people gravitate towards certain types of car. I get on well with Stag owners, but in fact Triumph owners in general. I have a Toledo myself and a Dolomite Sprint, which I rebuilt for Kevin. So, I let everyone know that I wasn't going to bother working on anyone else's cars in future, apart from Triumph Stags. Well, I'd have enough on me plate with him anyway, because there's always something needing doing with a Stag. But from time to time, I'd meet up with Ewan and Malcolm for a drink down the Dog and Duck, and we got on quite well, as long as we stayed away from certain topics. But what with the referendum result, we couldn't avoid the subject any longer. Ewan soon showed his true colours. He once said that xenophobes had shot themselves in the foot on account of how, when the Europeans go home, there'll be nobody to do certain jobs, and we'll end up with South Asians and the like coming over here to do them. Well, not that he thought that was necessarily a bad thing, but he reckoned that xenophobes hate them even more than they hate the Europeans. Now, I knew very well that when he used the word xenophobe, he was talking about yours truly. Pompous ass. Malcolm's a keen Brexiteer as well, which means he's all right in my book. I don't think he takes it as seriously as I do. I've been very careful not to say too much about foreigners in front of you, and what with him having a foreign wife, but I know he was there when our Kevin mentioned how I hate immigrants. I can't remember how the conversation started. I think Darren was there at the time. Darren's my oldest mate. He's lived in these parts all his life as well. We are birds of a feather. We always have a good laugh when it's just the two of us. I don't think Ewan would be very happy if he overheard our banter, especially when it comes to blue jokes and stuff about immigrants. Put it this way, we're not exactly politically correct, not by a long chalk. One time, all four of us were down at Dog and Duck, and Darren was going on about how much he hates the EU, and Ewan asked him why. Well, Darren mentioned sovereignty, but when Ewan asked him which European laws Darren was against, he couldn't think of any. But the conversation moved on to holidays, and Darren mentioned how he'd never been abroad and how he wouldn't want to on account of there being too many foreigners. Ewan said he wondered if sovereignty was the real reason Darren voted leave. So, whichever way you look at it, we're miles apart on Brexit. And to be honest, I would rather spend my time with people who don't look down on me because of my views. That's what it amounts to. I could tell it was a sport with Ewan. He liked picking holes in my arguments and making out all Brexiteers were thick or racist or both. And it wasn't easy to argue with him because he's had the benefit of a university education. And as I said, I left school when I was 16. As the months go by, I'll get the occasional text from Ewan suggesting we meet up for a drink down at Dog and Duck. But I just ignore them, as per usual. In the meantime, Ewan and Malcolm had set up this classic car gathering. A monthly meet-up in the car park at the Plough. It was the third Saturday of every month, kicking off at 9 in the morning. They called it the Wallingham ring, for some complicated reason known to themselves. I think they put a few leaflets under the windscreen wipers of cars at several local car meets. And Ewan wrote to classic car magazines telling them what they were planning. Oh, and of course they had to get permission from the manager of the plough. Anyway, the Wallingham ring starts off small, of course, but after a couple of months it soon picks up. Although there's a bit of an hiccup early on, because neither Ewan nor Malcolm could make it to the third or fourth meeting, and the pub wasn't open as early as usual. Now, some of the regulars were more interested in filling their bellies with a full English than standing around in a car park talking about cars, so they all go off to the Jolly Farmer, leaving the car park empty, so when more cars turn up, there's nobody there. Turns out some people had come quite a distance and had to turn around and go home. They probably never came back. Oh, when Ewan gets wind of this, he tears a strip off the ringleader Colin, and there was bad blood between them for a while. See, that's the thing about Ewan. He won't button his lip, and he's got a self-righteous streak. He's obviously not afraid of confrontation, and if he sees what he believes is bad behaviour, he's always quick to point it out. Yeah, too quick in my opinion. I remember thinking at the time I wouldn't be surprised if he hasn't had a few pints of beers thrown over him in his time. Or worse. Anyway, despite this setback, the Wallingham ring goes from strength to strength. And if we get good weather, the car park's bulging at the seams. I reckon there were over 150 cars there on one occasion. Now, I spend a lot of time on Facebook. I'm in all these members groups, and I don't just mean classic cars. We've got a couple of kittens at home, and I'm always posting cute pictures of them. Now, I thought it'd be a good idea to set up a Facebook members group for the Wallingham ring. Well, I didn't ask Ewan or Malcolm in case they said no. I didn't think they used Facebook much anyway. But I knew Ewan had an account, but I hadn't seen him make many posts. Well, not at the time anyway. He used email to run the gatherings. He put everyone who arrived on his email list, and there were a couple of hundred last time I heard. And then, just before each gathering, he used to send out a reminder. So, I set up this Facebook group with the same name as the gathering, the Wallingham Ring, and I let all my mates know. After a few months, we had about 40 members, not much going on. When Ewan gets wind of it, he doesn't say anything, but I could tell he wasn't best pleased. I suppose he thought that he and Malcolm should have been consulted. He certainly implied as much later. And then the lockdown puts a stop to the gatherings. And Ewan has the idea that as we won't be getting together again for a while, we should do something with the Facebook group. He wanted to create what he called a sense of community. He asks to be made an administrator of the group alongside me and Erwin Dawes, so I agreed. And then he reaches out to all the hundreds on his email list. In a few hours, the membership more than doubles, and Ewan starts posting something every day. First off, he asks members to post photos of their cars in interesting locations, and we get quite a lot of those. Then he starts posting what you might call short opinion pieces, looking at classic cars and what they say about their owners, all meant to be a bit tongue-in-cheek. I think he reckons himself to be a motoring journalist or something. He was obviously being deliberately provocative to try and get other members to respond. And it worked as well. You could see how the number of responses increased as his posts became more controversial. Eventually, there was quite a debate going on, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of his comments didn't start up to upset a few people. I don't think everyone appreciated his sense of humour. I think it's got something to do with the fact that he won't use emojis. Punctuation for the tone deaf, he called them. But in my opinion, it helps to use a smiley face if you're poking fun at something. Or at least a lol. He won't use that either for some reason. The problem is, I don't think people realised when he was joking. For example, he mentions how, along with the usual t-shirts and baseball caps, the Austin Allegro Owners Club also emblazons its logo on straitjackets. He said how people who drive Morris Marinas need help. Something about caring the community, that sort of thing. I just think he was a snob when it comes to classic cars. He said in one of his posts that excellence is nothing to do with how much you pay for a car. But, in fact, he has all these fancy foreign cars. So it's as if he's looking down on the common or garden British stuff, which, quite apart from anything else, is unpatriotic, if you ask me. In one of his posts, he mentions his experiences with local mechanics. How, when he lived in central London, he had his cars maintained by a variety of foreigners, Italians and Poles and the like, and how reliable and well-mannered they were. And then, when he moves to rural South London, all he finds is incompetence and bad manners. And the two decent mechanics he has found have this big drawback in that they don't usually answer his phone calls and messages. He says he's never experienced anything like this before, and was it a South London thing? Well, it might have been meant to be tongue-in-cheek, but of course he's talking about yours truly, and another bloke he's had a similar experience with. He didn't name names, but there's at least one member who knew that I worked on Ewan's cars, and I think he put two and two together. Especially as I'd worked on his car as well, and I hadn't always returned his messages neither. But he didn't make a big fuss about it. I can't tell you how furious I was. Rubbishing me on a public forum. The bloody cheek of the man, the fuckhead. When Ewan realises that others are beginning to twig, he quickly deletes the post, but he doesn't really apologise. Not properly, anyway. Then he sends me a private message saying discourtesy and bad manners should be called out wherever we find them. He's nothing but a pompous, self-righteous arsehole. First thing I do is I remove his administrator privileges. But I've got to find a way of defending myself. Now, if I were to respond directly, more members would guess it was me that he was talking about. So, I'll create this fake member called Fleur Bjord. It's easy enough, you just have to create a fake Facebook profile. I thought it would be a good idea being a woman, because when a man gets into an argument with a woman, he can soon end up sounding sexist or ungentlemanly, and I knew that would be the last thing that Ewan would want. The foreign-sounding name was a good idea as well, because anyone who knows me wouldn't associate me with a foreigner. So, using fake Fleur, I posted some messages attacking Ewan and pointing out why some people might not want to return messages for reasons other than bad manners. Of course, he doesn't realise it's me, and so he starts arguing his case. So, using fake Fleur, I throw a few personal insults in his direction, but he just starts ignoring her. Then some of the other members start wondering who she is, because frankly we don't get women at the gatherings, apart from the occasional wife or girlfriend. Oh, and Karen with a red Sunbeam Alpine. She's about the only one in a couple of hundred. Women just aren't interested in classic cars. I think women are just more sensible when it comes to cars. Well, when it comes to a lot of things now I think about it. My missus, I get nothing but grumbles from her if she has to use one of my classics. she's used to her heated seat pads and cup holders, and she can't park anything without parking sensors. Anyway, Fleur had done her job, so I took down her profile just in case anyone notices anything fishy, and Ewan goes back to posting his opinion pieces, trying to provoke others to respond. In one of these, he mentions a few cars which have what he calls a feminine quality, and fuck me if the Triumph Stag isn't amongst them. What a lot of rot! I'm sure he did that just to get at me. There is nothing remotely feminine about a stag. I mean, Christ, you can't come up with a more masculine sounding name. Stag, for God's sake. I mean, it's not the Triumph Hen, is it? Or the Triumph Fluffy Bunny Rabbit. No, a stag is a man's car by any standards. And quite a few stag owners in the Facebook group, all mates of mine, well, I look after their stags, don't I? Anyway, everyone was very upset with his comments. Some of the stag owners start attacking Ewan, and my mate Keith questions his sexuality. Although that backfired because Keith implied that there's something wrong with being gay, which might well be true, but you can't say that sort of thing nowadays. And more importantly, there's at least one young lad in the group who might be a bit upset about that on account of his own leanings. Oh, of course, Ewan gets on his high horse about homophobia and tears a strip off Keith, and then says I should have a word with him on account of him being my mate and what with me being the administrator. So, with one thing and another, I am getting fed up with Ewan. So, I'll come up with another fake profile to attack everything Ewan says from now on. Nobody's going to realise it's me, so that way I don't get my hands dirty. I used the name Rory Cowan, who's a not very well known Irish actor in my favourite TV show, Mrs Brown's Boys. Now, fake Fleur was all about defending me, but fake Rory is my attack dog. Yeah? So, now, every time Ewan posts one of his opinion pieces, fake Rory goes on the attack. Now, at first, Ewan responds calmly with a few facts and figures backing up his arguments, but when fake Rory describes all foreign cars as crap, Ewan asks whether that opinion extends to foreign people. Yeah, I thought he'd take the bait because he's sensitive about that sort of thing. He once said that most of the people around here were somewhere on the spectrum between mild xenophobes and outright racists. Well, I suppose it was all the leave posters in people's windows that set him thinking. Well, I tell you what, there certainly weren't any Remain posters to be seen. Not one. We know which side our bread's buttered on round here. So, the gloves are off, and fake Rory piles on the insults. But Ewan just ignores him. So, I post a few porky pies about Ewan to rubbish him, and then I prevent him from responding for 24 hours. So it looks like, to the others, he hasn't got anything to say in his defence. There's a lot to be said for being a Facebook group administrator. You have complete control over what's said and what isn't. Then, the next day, the shit hits the fan. I get this email from Ewan. It turns out he's worked out that Fleur and Rory aren't real. And it's just me using them to defend myself and attack him. Christ, I did not expect that. Reading between the lines, I think he must have noticed that the profiles were both empty, and I'm guessing he googled the names and came up with nothing apart from this Irish actor. And I think I might have mentioned that I like Mrs. Brown's Boys. Oh, yeah, I slipped up there. I mean, the fact is there were one or two inconsistencies, and I think he just put two and two together and made four. You've got to have a good memory when you're making things up. Anyway, I've been rumbled. And Ewan threatens to expose the truth unless I close the Facebook group down. I think he wanted to avoid these goings-on tainting his beloved gathering. What with it having the same name as the Facebook group, well, he should have thought about that. The trouble is, if I agree to close the group down, I'll definitely lose face. So I decide to bluff it out and deny everything. I think it would be difficult for him to prove anyway. I had to keep a lid on this if I was going to salvage my reputation. Ewan said he couldn't leave it alone, otherwise he'd be a party to the deception. So, Ewan goes ahead and tells everyone about the fake Facebook profiles, saying it's the other members who have been deceived. Then, I'll get my mates to rally round and back me up and throw a few insults in his direction at the same time. Anyway, I challenge him to give us his proof, but before he has a chance, I prevent him from responding for 24 hours, so it looks like he doesn't have any proof. And then, before the 24 hours are up, I delete his membership and the post about the fake profiles so he can go and fuck himself. And then, Ewan sets up a new Facebook group and changes the name of the gathering itself so as not to be associated with my Facebook group. And that's an end to it as far as he's concerned. Now, there are more than a few in my Facebook group who are beginning to suspect that Ewan might be right about the fake profiles. So, to preserve my reputation, I had to do something to try and convince them otherwise. So, I start a few pretend exchanges with fake Rory. I had him ask questions which I answered, technical questions about cars. Yeah, I know it's like talking to myself, but I'll get to show off my knowledge, and I think it created the right impression. The trouble is, I'd already made out that Fleur and Rory were local. But let's face it, most of the Facebook group is local and comes to the gatherings, or will do, in the near future. Now, I knew that when the gatherings get going again, if neither of them turn up, some people are going to start asking questions. So, whichever way you look at it, that's me in the shit. Now, the only way I could save face is if someone calling themselves Fleur or Rory turns up at the next gathering. Now, apart from the missus, I hadn't told anyone about the fake Facebook profiles, so I would have to take someone into my confidence if I was going to get them to play the part of Rory or Fleur. And it would have to be someone who wasn't known to anyone in the Facebook group and the gathering, which was a problem in itself. Now, that is where Sandra comes in. I don't think there's any point going into my past association with Sandra. Let's just say we'd known each other for a few years on a sort of professional basis. Yeah, I knew she'd do anything for a few quid, and she had the advantage of not being too local. Well, she lives a good 5 miles away in South Croydon. So, I explained the situation to her, and she agreed to come to the next gathering and introduce herself as Fleur Bjord. Now that the lockdown was being eased, we were due to have our first gathering in months. So, I set Sandra up at the Travelodge in Blackleaf. We met up there the night before to go over her backstory and get everything straight. Then, on the day of the gathering, I arrive in the Stag at 9:30, and there's already 50 or 60 cars there, including Ewan in his Renault. Then, about 10 minutes later, Sandra arrives in a taxi, and I wait until Ewan's talking with a fairly large group of people, and then I introduce Fleur to him and the others. Well, Ewan was surprised, but he tried not to show it. He welcomes her to the group, all very polite, and asks about her interest in old cars. And she manages to remember some of the stuff I told her, although she gets about half of it back to front. Then he admits that he thought she wasn't real and asks if she wouldn't mind showing him some ID. Well, she gets a bit flustered and swears at him like a trooper and then walks off. And then, to make matters worse, it turns out that Robert, who has 5 Austin Devons, knows her as well. Probably in the same way as I do, but he's not coy about it. Well, he's been on his own for a few years now since his wife left him. Probably on account of the Devons. He's surprised to see her there, and he calls her Sandra in front of everyone. And, well, she tries to talk her way out of it, but to be honest, she wasn't very convincing, and she keeps looking at me to help her out. Well, it was all a bit awkward and made a right mess of my little scheme. Now, not much was said to my face, but I couldn't help noticing that a lot of them in the Facebook group deleted their membership, including Darren and Malcolm. And then a week later, some of my mates have their usual Friday night meet-up down the Dog and Duck, and for the very first time, I wasn't invited. Oh, I know for a fact. Darren was there, along with Malcolm and Keith. So, naturally, I am very pissed off by all of this, and I decide to get my own back on Ewan by trashing one of his cars. He doesn't have enough garaging for all of them, so the Renault stands outside in all weathers. So, I walk up there at 2 o'clock in the morning in dark clothing with a Stanley knife in my pocket, and I set to slashing all 4 of his tyres and making some deep scratches down both sides of his car. Now, the problem is, apparently, the woman who lives opposite is an insomniac, and Ewan's drive is quite well lit. So I'm guessing she saw what I was up to, and she must have got on the phone to Ewan. So I'm about to leave when Ewan comes out in his dressing gown and confronts me, and we get into a bit of a scuffle. I honestly didn't mean to use the knife. It just happened to be there in my hand at the time. So I left him there, bleeding, on his drive, and I scarpered home as quick as I could. Now, I'm guessing that this neighbour saw what had happened, and she must have she must have recognised me. I'd only been home about half an hour when the police turn up, and, well, you know the rest. So, I've laid all my cards on the table, but I don't think I've left anything out. In your professional opinion, what do you think's going to happen to me? You must have seen cases like this, I would imagine. Haven't you? As a solicitor, I mean. What I'm trying to get at, is it self-defence or is it manslaughter? I mean, it's not actually murder, is it? Is it?